Okay, we have a nice color for the wash. It's a nice color for the mane to begin. We'll be able to add more colors later. But one of the things that's kind of important at this point to do is to do a little bit of background color, because with the mane flowing into the background area, we're going to have a problem with colors running between those few places where we have the mane going into the background. So I think it's a bit important at this point. You know, any darker colors of the mane that we add later to outline or shadow the main sections will go over a background glaze. But I think it's a good time to just do this little bit of background color. We have two choices. One is to use masking fluid on those light areas, and that way protect them from getting color on them when we do the background. But I think, given that this is, there aren't that many of these hairs that are going to be coming into this area, I think it's not that complicated at this point to do a little bit of color between them, and that way we don't have to think about it. So I'm thinking of a very, very light greenish, bluish green wash. Now the color that I'm using right now is called Cascade Green. I mean, it's fairly transparent, and I'm using it in a very light way. And it's not that bright a green, so I think it will go well with the horse color. I've tried it already, and I like the way it looks, and it's a nice amount of contrast, but not too much. And it gives a sense that of it being outdoors, and by being green. And this color, it does have a little bit of granulation in it. You can see that happening. But I'm just trying to make it as thin a wash as I can, so that it doesn't distract too much from very light mane, but yet provide a little bit of contrast. Okay, so I'm just going to continue to do that. I don't need to bore you with that slow process of creating the background. I'll just do one section up here by putting in some water first, and then I'll drop color into that, because this is a nice big area. And so then I can drop this color in, and in that area I would want it a little darker anyway, up in the corner here, just frame the picture a little better. But then you can see the granulation that's happening in this color. I may have to come back and do a little bit more on that because of all the granulation. But anyway, I'm going to blot that because, frankly, that's not working with the water. It's better to just do it the way I was doing the other ones. And painting it in without it going into the water. So I'm just mixing with some water on the side, and then there. There we go. It's always a little bit of a challenge to blend some of these colors together so that they are fairly even from section to section. But I think it's coming out, so you don't need to watch me fiddle with that for all the background, but this is more or less what I'm going to do. There'll be some variation here and there. We want a little bit anyway. Not a lot, but a little bit, not as an abstraction. So that's something I'm going to continue. And there will be this soft, and then it will dry lighter. There'll be this soft greenish background to the whole painting. So after that's done, I'll let it dry for a little while, and then we'll come back and work on the face. I know that you can look up the horse skull on your own computer, but I just want to make sure that you have some sense of the eye socket, and then above the eye socket there's an indentation, and this is the ridge that we see and feel on the horse's face that comes out, and below that is this plate that's part of the lower jaw, that is a flat bony plate that makes up the bottom part of the face. You don't see these teeth ever on the horse. They're all covered with fur, but they're there. There's a lower jaw section of the skull and an upper section of the skull. And then there's this bone that comes down in the center, and it has a crevice in it. And all of the nostril area that comes out is very soft. There's no bone in that soft nostril area. So this is an interesting image. And I also just wanted to show you, in general, the typical coloring of a palomino. This is a young palomino, but just to give you a sense of the color, as they get older, sometimes they might get a little bit darker. Each one is slightly different in how light or how dark they are, and how light or how dark their mane is. But this is the general color, and you can see as we zoom in the brown eyes The horse is unique because it can see all the way around in front and on the side. The only place it can't see is behind. And so you always generally approach the horse from the side, and then it can see you very well from the side. And you usually approach the horse from the side and touch its shoulder, not putting your hand on the top of the head or even down under its mouth. It really can't see there. It sees very well on the side, so approaching the horse from the side is generally what people who know horses well. And this is a very nicely brushed mane, but we're going to be doing a mane that is more dreadlocks a little bit. You can see all of this. This is the bone I talked about coming down. And see this ridge on both sides? And then the bone comes down to about here, and then all this soft nostril, the flaring in the nostrils is soft. There's no bone in that. There's bone that comes down in the middle, or there's teeth bone down here, but this is soft. And this is hard and sharp, and underneath the cheek is hard and sharp. And I showed you the shape of the square shape of the eye. You can see it here, and the socket above the eye. And then there's a hole for the ears. There's also, I mean, this socket here for the eye is a square shape on this front part and circular on the other part. Okay. The eye does not have a round pupil. The pupil is actually rectangular, and that's the way we've drawn it on our drawing. So I just wanted to show you that. We are going to use that that coloring. I'm going to make that kind of skin coloring, and that will be glazed over all of the skin area of the horse. And this is the way it's beginning to look. I'll just hold it up for you to see. The light is very bright, but you get a sense of the underpainting that is existing with the ridge here coming down, and the nostril shape, the squared off part here, and then the ears. Okay. Well, I finished the background with that Cascade green, and I added to that some manganese blue, which granulates and has a kind of a greenish bluish hue. And I also added to that a little cerulean blue, but mostly I added just a little bit of this. Cascade green is a very dark green, but when watered down it has a nice glow. And I thought it would be a good background for this palomino horse. I have a palomino horse in my pasture, and they're always a little different in terms of how light or how dark they are, but they have blonde hair or flaxen hair. It is the hair, when they're out in the pasture a lot like mine are, does not look smooth and brushed like corn silk. It kind of twists around a little bit like wild horses' hair does. And so I like to show that more natural look. And of course there are times of the year when it gets, oh guys, hey guys, shh, 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 shh. Hey, I'm gonna let you look at me. Shh, shh, shh. Sometimes if they can see me, they will bark. So I mentioned to you that I put a very light yellow wash on this because I wanted to have that base set, and I thought I would put a little more, and that was for the mane, but it also the skin. I'm going to put a little more soft yellow on the skin in some areas that are in light, and will be in highlight relative to my initial, oh you guys, that's not nice. So so I'm going to do some of that in a few areas. And that will be in the areas of where the light is hitting and there is the strongest yellow color. I can always come back and glaze with more color later, but at this point I like to just indicate that there are some areas that are more in the light than others. So like the top of this nostril is getting hit by the sun, this ridge, this bony ridge. When one looks at the skulls, you see this very bony ridge that comes out here. Then there's a very bony ridge above the eye that makes a sort of square shape above the eye. And I also want to just indicate that the eye has a tendency, it's a brown eye, but it has a very golden cast to it. And so I'm going to put some of that golden color. Okay, I think that's a good start. And then as the color of the horse moves into shadow, there'll be more of a rose cast. And rather than just go to a brown, I'm going to put some of this rose madder in the transition zone. It's a very transparent paint, and when it's painted a little bit over some of the yellow, you of course start to get a more orange golden cast to the color. And then when I go into the shadow area, normally I would use some blue. And it's very similar to what is done with human portraiture. So I'm going to use some cobalt blue. I'm going to put some of that in the shadow area that is under this bony ridge. And the cheekbone has a very large, this cheek is a very large plate, bony plate. So I have to paint around these hairs, unfortunately, but with a good pointed brush that isn't too complicated. This one is a Taklon mix, so it has probably some hair and some goat. Yeah, it has some goat hair. And some synthetic, but it has a very nice point to it. So I'll put a little bit of that blue. Now when I go over this with some of the more golden hair color, I probably will use some burnt sienna in that mix to make that color. But for now, I'm just going to begin to show the transition from light to shadow by using these three colors, and then I will mix a color to use that will glaze over this, but that will then still show some of this underlying shadows. And I don't want to put them everywhere, but just in the areas of some of the deeper shadows. And in some places they might go over the rose a little bit, make a little bit of a violet. Accentuate that front plate of the nose a bit. Here, I'll put it over this rose a little bit. And I'm going to put some also to accentuate the shadows in that area of the socket, which has a large bone above, and then there's bone here that forms almost a square shape on this side. And then there's a bit of eyelid. I won't do too much, just a little bit. And just taking some of that color out with a fairly damp, semi-dry brush so that it spreads nicely. And there's a fair amount of shadow under the eye in a bit of a so this underlying coat will provide some interesting diversity, so that we're not just using a kind of deciding, okay, my palomino is this color, and I'm just going to lay that color everywhere, you know, and make it a little darker in some places and a little lighter in some places. I don't really like to do that. I like to have the glazes, the very subtle thin glazes, show through. One has to try to do it in a way that it's not, you don't have, that you have some soft edges in here. Yeah. But this is, so I'm just going to continue this process and paint between the areas of mane, leaving those blonde and not putting color on those areas. So that is the process that I'm going to continue basically everywhere between the mane. No, that's right on the mane. I have to. Between the mane, there will be shadow. So I'm going to lightly, with the cobalt blue, indicate that and paint those areas in. And that's the way I'm going to continue all through this main area and through this main area, because it's pretty much going to be in shadow all under the main area. So all of this area between the hairs will have this light blue glaze. With the cobalt blue. Okay, and that's the way I'll continue that here. And when that part is all done, then we'll come back and go into detail of the skin tone and try to make this look like a palomino. A palomino, by the way, is, if I haven't mentioned it, I don't think I did, is bred with a chestnut and a palomino together to get a horse that has a dilution factor. So basically the color of a palomino is chestnut plus a dilution gene, and that gives it its light color. I also have a cremello out in my pasture, and a cremello looks like a very cream-colored horse, and it has blue eyes. And that is a palomino mixed with 2 dilution factors. So, and 25% of the horses that are bred to try to get a cremello are able to result in a cremello, which is a cream-colored horse with blue eyes. So, like in dog breeding, the dilution factors come into play. I breed standard poodles, and sometimes, you know, I breed blacks and I breed whites. I don't deliberately breed colors. But almost all the blacks in the U.S. and around the world have within their lines some dogs having dilution factors. And so when you get a black that has a gene that is called the dilution gene, then it will turn blue. It's like a slate blue. And that's different than graying. When the dogs gray over time, they just kind of get salt and pepper looking, grays. And some black dogs just stay very inky black, but most of them do gray a little bit as they get older. But some have this dilution gene, and they become a kind of slate blue instead of gray. So every now and then, and usually we can tell the ones with the dilution genes because they have a few white hairs when they're born underneath their paws of their feet. So all the black lines do have some dilution genes. That might turn up here and there. Okay. I'll get back to you when the shadowing with the cobalt is done. All right, now we looked at the basic image of a palomino, and I'm putting on my palette some yellow ochre, and I'm adding to it some very transparent vermilion, which gives it a little more of a brighter yellow, because I don't want it to be too earthy and muddy. We can always add some more color, but that is, I want it at least half and half, the yellow ochre and the Aurelian yellow. And if I were to take a little bit of a test paper, when you take this color and you apply it as it is mixed, it might look a certain darkness, but if you add a lot of water to it, it would be much lighter. So my inclination would be to start with a lighter glaze and not to have too much opaqueness in the color to begin and not too dark to start. I could bring in a little bit of gamboge, which is slightly, well, gamboge is also similar color. I could bring in a little bit of that. And I could bring in a little bit of burnt sienna. You see, this is burnt sienna. I will be bringing in some burnt sienna for part of the horse's color, the part that is a little more in shadow. So just to show you, I've got two colors here, and I'll use the burnt sienna in the more shadow areas, mixed with this yellow and yellow ochre and Aurelian yellow. And I'll use the more brighter combination of the two yellows for the other area, and add the water that is needed to so you can see here, this one with the burnt sienna in it gives you a little bit different color, more of the shadow color that we saw. And so in some areas I'll glaze with that, and in other areas I'll glaze with the yellow. So just to begin that process, I'll show you a section. This is just the yellow combination, glazing over the undercoat. And you can see some of the undercoat showing through. And it gives it a kind of glow, I think, a depth. So in these lighter areas, I'm sticking with the yellow tones. But now I'm going to take some of this darker burnt sienna mixture that's also where I added burnt sienna to the yellow, and I'm putting that into the areas where I have more of that blue shadow. You see? And then blending. So, for example, over here, more of the yellow mixture that I showed you. And going into the burnt sienna mixed with the yellow mixture over here. Get a little more coverage and a little more depth, but it's still in the same family. And it'll take on some of the diversity that is in the undercoat, where the values are already painted in through the undercoat. So I don't really have to worry so much about my values at this point, my light and dark values. You see? Take some of that burnt sienna, put that in that little indented area that is above the eye. And then we'll do the shadow inside the ear later. Again, I'm going to take some of that light yellow ochre and then some of the burnt sienna mix in the shadow area over the blue, but transitioning the two different mixtures, glazing over like that. So this is the beginning of that process, and I'll just keep up with that. I'll take the burnt sienna mixture under this bony crevice here in the shadow, and so I have only two mixtures. The mixture of the yellows, and then that's that mixture of the yellows to which I have added burnt sienna. And I can come in, and as I go down into this lighter area, just the yellows, glazing over. And as I go into more detail later, again, glazing over that with the yellows. So that process, once you've got your undercoating, is pretty quick. Over here, where this was in shadow, and there's some blue and red layering on top of each other in that shadow. I put the burnt sienna mixture over that, and you can see how it gets transformed. But yet it has that depth and diversity in the undercoat that comes through. This will be a darker shadow in here, and I can put a little bit of this color, but frankly this is going to be a very dark in there. I will use Payne's Gray in there. But I'll continue and use those two mixtures between most of the hairs where it's dark in the shadow, and we put the blue. We use the burnt sienna mixture between those hairs because they're in shadow, and I'm using the darker mixture for those. Okay, so that's the next step. I don't need to have you watch every bit of that next step, but you'll now see it when we do the new stage of putting in the shadows, the details, the nostrils, the eyes, and then we'll go back and do a little more depth where we need to define the structure of the face. But at this point, it is the undercoat of the transitional colors of yellow in the light, moving through rose into, as you transition from the shadow, and into blues and violets in the deepest shadows. The violet was created where I put a little bit of rose over the blue, got some violet in the most deep areas. Okay, that's a good point to break, and then I will proceed with some of that painting between the hairs, and then we'll come back and do the details. Okay, I just want to show you the typical eye. Here's that squared off, see that squared off bone here at the top and on the side? And then there's the whole eye socket for the round ball of the eye. And you can see the rectangular shape of the pupil and several crevices. Very little white of the eye is showing, usually in a horse. And this is all very round in here. But this bone creates an important set of the structure. And above the bone, there was this crevice in the bone. It has an indentation in the bone, and this bulge here. So I just wanted to show you that. We are not using a photograph for our horse because I have my own palomino, and so we're using my own sketches and impressions for that work. But I just wanted to give you, between the bone structure and some close-ups of an eye, it gives you an idea of how to approach dealing with that. So I'm going to take some basic Van Dyke brown, which is a very, very dark brown. And I'm going to use that to work on this eye, creating the shadow here of the eyelid. And where it comes down, you have that little area, just like humans also have, where it folds and the eyeball fits in. So I'm going to start that process of shaping the eye and making the shadow using the Van Dyke brown, because now I'm going to use mostly browns and ochres and colors in the earth range. We have enough of the undercoat to still shine through. So, and just as I showed you on that image, there is another area of the eyelid above And there are several folds of skin in there. And this is pretty much all focusing on the eyeball, which is in this hole in the skull. There's a complete hole in the skull, which is circular in general, except for this shape that is created by this here on this side, this kind of squared off shape in the bone. And then above that squared off shape, there's an indentation and a mound, like the bone goes out, and there's a mound and some folds of skin again around that mound. So the eye is one of the most interesting bony structures. The bone around the eye is the most detailed of the bony structures that one sees on the horse. So there's a little bit of a indentation here, because right here now you have this squared off shape, but then you have this whole empty structure in the bone that is a hole for the eyeball to fit inside that hole. And as we use some of these browns for some of these parts of the horse, that will tone and change the underlying blues and roses that are there. Yeah. And I mentioned to you there's an indentation in the bone above the eye, and that indentation, the bone has got a curve under, and so that shows up on the surface of the horse and always creates a little bit of a shadow. Okay, and so we'll just blend that shadow. And then above that, some distance above that, there's a hole here. There's a hole here, and that hole, through that hole, the ear comes up. So the ear is not really a bony structure, but it comes up. There's a hole that the ear fits in, and it comes up. And inside the ear, will have quite a bit of depth of shadow, because it's the light is coming from this side, and so deep in here there would be shadow, and that shadow would be not just brown but a little more dark. So I'm going to take a little bit of ivory black and drop that in with the Van Dyke brown to make an indication of that shadow that would be in the ear, in the inside of the ear. And normally there are some hairs all around the ear. It's a detail that sometimes I show, but I'm not going to show on this horse because I think it would be more detail than we need to do. Okay. So here, the rim around the pupil is very dark on a horse. Usually there's a blackish color, so I am going to show that in black. Okay. And the eye of the horse, as I said to you, is brown. On a palomino, it's brown. On some horses, I have a cremello out there that is got blue eyes, light blue eyes. And I have a paint horse out there in my pasture that has eyes that are partly blue and partly brown. But most horses have brown eyes. But those brown eyes are such big balls, and they have a golden hue to them. So I am going to throw some any kind of gold and yellow, like a raw umber would work, or just a light yellow. I'm going to throw that in there, and then once that is dry, then I will a little more dark here. Let that go for now. And then I'll put some dark in this corner here, a little dark. So you don't really see red very often inside the eye, and you rarely see white, so I'm not going to show it. But it is a little lighter in the corner, just a little lighter. But we don't want to show too much white. When you see the white of a horse's eye, it's only generally when they're scared. Then you will see a little white around the eye. But this is a relaxed eye. The horse is relaxed. His head is down and relaxed. He's not he's not got his head sticking up and looking tense. His ears are not looking tense. His eye is looking relaxed and alert, looking at you out of the side, which is typical because they see best when you're on their side. Yeah, so that's the eye. I don't want to put the pupil in yet but I am going to put down here the nostril while I'm waiting for that area to dry. And that's what we do in watercolor. We move around from one area to another, giving an area time to dry. So I'm going to do, hair on my brush. I'm going to show the nostrils down here that are here. As I said, there's this bone structure through the center of the front of the horse, but there's no bone around the nostrils. They're just folds of skin. So we'll indicate some of those folds of skin. That will be a little bit in shadow, and some of the again the Van Dyke brown, but with a little more water in them, so that it's still Van Dyke brown, but it's lighter because I put more water. So I'm just showing some shadow around the way that nostril would look. And then there would be some shadow under that bone. So, but instead of putting the earlier blue and violets in the shadow, we've already done that, so I am using the Van Dyke brown to create a little more definition to this bony structure in the center here, which has a definite crevice that goes down the center of that bone. So I'm just highlighting that a little bit. I don't want it too strong, but enough so that we acknowledge that it's there. And I had already put some blues under some of this mane, but I'm just going to put a little bit more of the burnt sienna now, layering that in some places under the mane, emphasizing the mane just a little bit more, where the sun comes from the left and casts a shadow. And so I'm not filling the whole space, just casting the shadow on the skin tone that we already put down, that is being cast by the hair above. Okay. And this, again, it just creates some depth and diversity in the image. It clarifies that something's in shadow, keeping the same skin tone, but showing the shadow with the Van Dyke brown, which is a good. I would use some blue or violet in the shadow if I hadn't already done the undertone. But since that undertone is there, I don't want to make the horse too blue. And this begins to define the hair and the light, the value, contrast of the light casting shadows. Oh, my horses, my dogs are just about ready for bed. Okay, so that's the beginning of that. I'll go take care of my dogs, give this a chance to dry, and I'll use the same Van Dyke again under this bony edge there. And now I'll go tend to those crazy critters. See what a little bit. Okay. I'm going to take a little bit of burnt sienna and mix it with a little bit of the Van Dyke brown. Get a little darker burnt sienna. And as I have done over here, I just want to show you I'm putting some lines in the hairs of different intensity of darkness, some more watery, some less watery, but just to indicate that this is not just a blob of hair, but that there are some individual lines in there, some darker than others, and make some of the spaces between the hairs a little more defined. I've done a bit of that over here. That may do a little more. But that's just the beginning of doing the detail. But you don't add something like this until you're pretty close to being done with the hair. I'm going to put more shadow on the skin around the chin area and over here in the eye area. But it's a point where I can go into some of these large areas of hair and begin to lightly with my thin liner brush just indicate here and there some definition of hairs. We never want to show them all, but I need to break up those these yellow areas, and I may even use some darker yellows, for example. I can do that too. Just put some yellow in there, here and there, to highlight, like here, just to highlight so that the yellow is not so pale everywhere. Just the subtlest thing here and there to give that hair a little more life. I think you can see that that little bit of yellow, for example. I was using a new gumboche for that. But any warm yellow here and there, leaving some very light, but putting a little bit of more strong yellow in some places so that it's not all so pale. Okay? Because the hair on the horse, like over here, I'm going to put some yellow here and there. The horse, when it's out, it gets very, very dirty. And it gets, prickers in its hair and thistles and burdock burrs and all sorts of things, and all the hairs get all tangled up. I know, because I'm always tending to when they get them really messed, I have to go and clear all of them out. It's amazing how much the burdock can make a mess of the horse's hair. And I don't really mind that it's got stuff in it, but when the hair is, they always seem to get the burrs in this area here near the eyes, and that's not good. You don't want to have all those burrs near their eyes that possibly could scratch the eyes. So I just wanted you to see that this process of, and I'll show you next to it, the blank bits of mane versus the areas where we're starting to put in a little bit of detail. And that process will continue, okay? And I'll finish the detail inside of the mane, leaving some areas more clear and some areas with hairs in them, a little more shadow here and there between the hairs. And then we'll come back and finish the darker shadows in some areas of the face, and the painting will be done. I'm still detailing the hairs, and that process will continue. But as the painting dries, I am deepening the shadows as well. So I take some Van Dyke brown, which I had showed you before, and in some of the areas I put that. But I'm also putting an intense red. I'm using transparent red oxide. Or alizarin crimson. They're both good reds for that. And making that Van Dyke brown in some areas. Oh dear. They'll stop. A little more interesting. And so I just want you to see how I'm putting some of these colors as another overlay in the shadows, because I've already put some Van Dyke brown in the shadow, but sometimes a little more intensity in a few places, not overdoing it, just carefully looking at the painting and seeing where I need a little more of that to define the small curves of the face. So I'm going to put a little bit here and there, a little tiny bit. Let's see, I'd already put Van Dyke brown in that shadow and here, but now I'm putting another bit, and that little bit of the alizarin crimson or the transparent red oxide into the Van Dyke brown will build up a little more excitement in these corners so they don't become dead spaces. So I'm just putting in, and after more than 30 years of having horses in my life and grooming them, sometimes riding as much as 5 times a week, riding all over the world and riding my horses at home, and for a while they were in a stable, but then for the last 25 years they've been here at home. And you get to know through your hands the feeling of the face and the body, and where the sharp bones are, where the bits of fleshy skin are located. And it's like when you play a piano or you type on a typewriter, your hands have muscle memory. Artists work to develop muscle memory through their repetition in drawing. But some of that muscle memory, for me, is the reason that I do horses. I have the muscle memory from grooming horses, endless hundreds of hours, and touching them and riding them, being with them when they're part of your daily life. So that just gives a little more pop to some of these shadows. You see, that little bit of, instead of just a dark brown, making, you can also do the same thing by having, if you have magenta on your palette, you can put a little bit of magenta in there. I'll show you there. A little bit of magenta in that dark brown, or just magenta alone over the brown, and a little bit of, put a little bit of that. And that can brighten and help some of the shadows to be a little more interesting. We don't overdo it, but I wanted to show you over here I've already done shadows on this dark remote eye, but this is really in shadow under the hair. And so I'm going to put in and I'm not covering everything, just a few spots here and there to help make that shadow pop. And I just stuck my hand on top of I felt my hand was wet, and yet I put it there, so I have to pick up the marks that I left there. There. So the face, I think, is getting pretty, little magenta there too. I had already just put, as you saw, the Van Dyke brown, but I'll put a little magenta on top, and or side by side. Everybody has their own way of placing color, but I do like to, like the Impressionists did, they had different colors side by side with each other, and when you stand back, then the illusion that creates, the excitement it creates. So I'm putting some magenta in a different spot. Here and there it's very transparent. And magenta, if you don't have it, would be just a little bit of alizarin crimson and cobalt blue. Would give you that into your palette. Most colors can be made with just the few basics of a few earth tones, a couple of browns, and two or three blues, 2 or 3 reds, and a couple of yellows, and you can make almost anything you want or need. But it is fun to have a lot of colors too. Makes it more fun for me. I don't need them, but I love them. Okay, just do a couple of these with the magenta because it's a little different, so it brings some diversity into a couple of these. And I still have the fine lines to do on those. And there's one more thing that I can do, and that is bring in a tiny bit of final white highlights on some hairs. Not the very little, but I'm going to put a little tiny dot in the eye, and I'm just going to put a few little tiny white hairs to help them stand out a little bit. Don't want to do too much of that. It has to be just the thinnest amount of line so that it doesn't show up to be an opaque spot. That one's a little too thick, so I'll just go back, remove it. But it was hard to keep these lines as interesting as I wanted them to be, painting around them with negative painting. And So adding a small amount of white highlight can be done. And the eyelashes of the palomino are white now. We can't overdo that, but we can indicate just a few, and they're often long. They're often very, very long. So we can indicate just a few eyelashes. I don't want to take away too much from the basic issue with the painting is the shadows and the form, but a little bit of tiny, tiny, tiny thin, done with a rigger brush. A little bit of white at the very end of a painting can make this pop. So that's really all I have to show you, I think, on this painting. Thank you for watching.